There is no shortage of weird family trees in media as a whole, and definitely not in the Marvel Universe. But if you ask me to pick just one from the comics, I will go with the Grey family tree. You know, the one with Jean Grey. It seems like a normal family in the beginning, with a history professor dad, a loving mum, and some siblings. Looking at them, you might think nothing could go wrong, except that one of the daughters ends up becoming a cosmic entity, capable of wiping out all of life on Earth. So, how did something like this happen? Was the trigger pulled in Jean's childhood, or was it something that began far earlier? Oh, and if that was not enough, Jean later married into the Summers family, which made things even messier. Since you are here anyway, I assume detailed breakdowns are right up your alley. Grab a coffee while I start dissecting this family tree all the way from the 18th century to a future that never happened, where the Grey bloodline actually begins. I just had to use that reference. After all, we are talking about iconic families, and the Von Trapps definitely qualify. But yes, we need to start long before John and Elaine Grey showed up asking for Charles Xavier's help. So let's travel to the 18th century, when Lady Grey became the Black Queen of the American offshoot of the Hellfire Club. She replaced Lady Diana Knight, who became the Red Queen. Along with these two women, Black King Sir Patrick Clemens and Red King George Clinton formed the inner circle of the Hellfire Club. They sided with the British during the American Revolutionary War and made efforts to ensure their victory, which brought them to Philadelphia. Any good plan involves a bit of espionage, so their intention was to control Major General Wallace Worthington and uncover the military secrets of the 13 colonies from him. This is where Lady Jean Grey came across her little pet project in the form of Elizabeth Shaw, a 15-year-old girl who had emigrated from Britain a few years earlier. However, life in America was far from what she had hoped, which forced her to steal food to survive. Lady Grey brought her back to the glittering mansion owned by the Hellfire Club, and confided in her about how she had joined it to become an influential figure, and she needed a protege who shared the same fiery ambition as herself. Impressed by the girl, she recruited Elizabeth and made her a central figure in her plans to get those military secrets out of the Major General. After 6 months of intense training in the art of seduction, among other things, Elizabeth was sent to Wallace, and they ended up marrying soon afterward. Side note, I know it sounds really problematic to groom a teenager because that is essentially what Lady Grey did, but this was the 1700s. I cannot really change what is written in the comics, can I? Back to our discussion now. Elizabeth ended up falling in love with her husband and refused to divulge anything. She became quite the thorn in the side of the Hellfire folks because they were pretty desperate to end the pitiful American Revolution. Lady Jean Grey threatened Elizabeth, saying that she would lose everything, and true to her word, she led a group of mercenaries into the Worthington house one night. He was brutally tortured to reveal the military plans, but he refused to open up. His house was then set on fire, and he burned to death as a result. But this also foiled the plans to stop the separation of the 13 colonies from Britain. Now, you might be wondering what significance this ancestor has to the Jean Grey we know. Well, in modern times, Mastermind tried to manipulate Jean into becoming the Black Queen of the modern Hellfire Club by showing her illusions that convinced Jean she was actually inhabiting the body of the original Lady Grey. We see this happen in X-Men 125, and this is where things get a little murky. You see, it has not been officially confirmed whether the illusions Mastermind showed Jean reflected the actual life of her ancestor, or if they were just part of his imagination. According to them, Lady Grey lived during the Regency era, and from what happens in X-Men 126, she invited many people, including her lover, to a hunt, except that they were hunting a person dressed as a stag. She later sailed to New York with that man and married him there, after which she became the Black Queen of the Hellfire Club. As you can probably infer from this kind of behaviour, she and her husband were slave owners who supported the British during the American Revolution. One day, the slaves betrayed them by allowing members of the Continental Army into their mansion. But in Mastermind's illusions, these slaves and soldiers were replaced by Storm and the X-Men. So much for subtlety, right? The reason I said these illusions are iffy is that Mastermind showed the same stag human hunt scene to Mystique later, where it was confirmed that the year was 1783 in England. This contradicts the previous illusions because the War of Independence in America ended that year, and Lady Grey had become the Black Queen in 1780. So she could not have possibly still been in England in 1783. Since two different comics, X-Men and X-Men Hellfire Club, offer different storylines, it is up to you to choose any one version of events. We have more ancestors to discuss because Jean Grey's information in X-Men Phoenix Force Handbook No. 1 lists Charles Grey and Malkin Grey as her ancestors as well. Charles was a very wealthy British nobleman and a member of the Hellfire Club too. In Marvel Frontier Comics Unlimited No. 1, he killed himself due to the crippling fear of being possessed by the devil, but his spirit ended up wandering the world for at least another 100 years. I mean, do normal people turn into spirits after dying, or is that a mutant thing? Oh, but we are not done. The grey genome was a pesky little thing, you see, because after slave owners, child groomers and spirits, we've yet another alleged ancestor who is at least more interesting than the others. Fiona Noblack, aka Dark Mother, made her first appearance in Cable 88 in December 2000. Jean Grey is listed as an alleged descendant of hers, as both of them were carriers of the grey genome. Once again, Marvel does not do a great job of fleshing out her exact details, so she's believed to have German or American roots. What is established, however, is that her older sister Gloria was burned at the stake during the Salem witch trials, which was the turning point in her life. She watched the man responsible for Gloria's death later become the governor of the state and face no consequences, so she took matters into her own hands. Over the years, she developed an intense hatred of all men and murdered her parents to inherit their estate. Then, she married 3 times and killed all her husbands after having kids with them to inherit their wealth as well. The bottom line here is that the deeper you dig, the messier this family tree gets. Moreover, Marvel also treats a lot of this as legend instead of confirmed lore, but it is still an interesting point to begin the discussion on the Grey family because most people tend to leave this bit out. John and Elaine Grey, the parents who never saw it coming. Now for the actual normal-seeming couple at the root of all this chaos, John and Elaine Grey. John taught history at Bard College, and neither he nor his wife knew about Jean's mutant abilities. In X-Men number 5, after enrolling their daughter at Xavier's school for gifted youngsters, they were under the impression that it was simply a prestigious private school where Jean had received a full scholarship. They were initially quite reluctant to send her away, but when the school was recommended by her higher-ups in Washington DC, they let her go. The reason for the secrecy was chalked up to the fact that the institution handled affairs related to national security, so the Greys assumed Jean was being taught something related to science. Every week, Professor X would write to them about Jean's progress and her peers at school to reassure them of her safety. At one point, the couple even swung by the school in person to check on their daughter while heading into the city for the World's Fair. And Elaine ended up disappointed because they were unable to meet with the professor in person. It was at this time that they came across Scott Summers, and Elaine was intrigued by his sunglasses and tried to touch them. Scott was alarmed and ended up being a bit rude with her because he thought she was going to take them off. Now this whole secrecy aspect unfortunately applied to many of the mutants at the school, and Jean's family was not the only one that did not know the truth about their daughter, but I don't think this could entirely be blamed on Professor X, because he could not exactly pull a Hagrid and tell these people that their child was gifted, but not in the way they believed. I do believe that a lot of the things that happen in the future, especially with Jean turning into the Dark Phoenix, could have probably been controlled to some extent if her real family was aware and supportive of her needs. John Grey later denounced Jean when she came to their home and threatened her family, as seen in X-Men 136 to 137. And even Elaine said she wished Jean had never been born when she watched her whole family get murdered at the hands of Shi'ar Death Commandos. These issues were hit really hard, because they just dealt with the killing of people who were completely innocent otherwise. When Rachel Grey told Black Cloak that the children there did not deserve to die, she got a very calculated response. They bear your genome. What happened afterwards struck her worse, because Elaine slapped her across her face and called her a monster. Rachel could only let out a small please grandma before the older woman renounced her and cursed the day Charles Xavier entered their lives. She eventually died, along with the rest of her family. Despite being told that Elaine did not mean her last words, Rachel was a telepath, so she was able to understand that everything her grandmother had uttered was indeed the truth, and in her last moments, she genuinely wished that she had never given birth to Jean. I will discuss this massacre in detail soon, because just a few lines cannot do justice to its sheer brutality. What makes me sad every time, though, is that the Grey family truly never saw the danger coming. They just did what they thought would be best for their child. Unfortunately, it cost them heavily. Jean's forgotten siblings, Brian and Julia Grey. If you think Jean's parents serve no purpose other than being cannon fodder, I just want to tell you to buckle up, because it gets worse. You see, when she was first introduced, she had only one older sister, Sarah. I will get to Sarah in a while too, because she deserved a better storyline. But for now, let's turn to Uncanny X-Men 466, before the family is wiped out, when we are suddenly introduced to 2 other Grey siblings who were never mentioned in any comic issue before. We see Jean's daughter Rachel living at her grandparents' house, and they have all accepted her as family, while being aware of her powers. She plays basketball with John Grey, and asks Elaine to join and cheer for her. However, she cannot help but overhear her grandmother's thoughts whenever the older lady comes across a picture of Jean and curses Professor X for taking her away. Later, the 3 of them also attend a family get-together where we are introduced to 2 siblings named Brian and Julia for the first time. Everything goes well. Rachel even meets a boy named Terry Maguire, and they develop a very quick romantic interest in each other. But Grandpa Grey breaks up the moment soon enough. He then says, "I wish when your mother was with us, we'd know how to cope better." The rest of the family was inside, and when the Shi'ar Death Commandos arrived, all hell broke loose in the blink of an eye. Rachel could only watch in horror as her Aunt Julia is killed, and it is explained that the latter was a chef who owned a restaurant famous for serving home-style food. There's a slight mix-up with these characters across the continuity, and I will get to that later. But if we go strictly according to Uncanny X-Men 468, what I've just mentioned stands true. I've read a lot of comics retcons, but this one always struck me as unusually blunt. You do not typically introduce brand new immediate family members in one issue purely so a hit squad can erase them in the next, just to raise the emotional stakes. It reads less like a long-lost family reveal and more like Marvel simply needed disposable bodies, so they created two more characters out of thin air who were close enough to Jean and Rachel for their deaths to be more impactful. Fans have picked this apart for years, and I cannot really blame them. Sarah Gray, the sister who stayed ordinary. Sarah appears in numerous comic issues and is firmly established as a very supportive older sister to Jean. In X-Men Origins, Jean Grey #1, we see her being extremely distressed following Jean's traumatic experience of witnessing a friend Anne's car accident, which she felt in her mind as though it was happening to her. After spending some time at the hospital, when Jean returned, she was nothing like the sister Sarah knew. When Charles Xavier was finally able to reach out to her using his telepathy, Sarah was overjoyed and said, "Welcome back, Jeannie," while hugging her. Later, Jean moved to Professor X's school, and Sarah graduated normally and moved to Albany. Jean made plans to visit her during her vacation, as shown in X-Men First Series number 22. Soon enough, the Greys came to know about who Jean really was, that she was a member of the X-Men. In Albany, Sarah was living the polar opposite of her younger sister's life. She met a man named Paul Bailey and they married. She had twin children with Paul named Joey and Galen. The couple went on vacation along with Jean and Scott on Shelter Island, and during this time, Sarah was still trying to come to terms with exactly what her sister's abilities entailed. She wondered why the mutant gene had skipped her, and what would happen if her children manifested powers later. While her apprehension was purely from concern for her family, it offended Jean, who said, "Don't you really mean they'd be freaks? Freaks like me?" The two of them tried to clear up the misunderstanding, but were soon enveloped in a mysterious fog and knocked out. They were actually kidnapped by Atlanteans and taken to Atuma, the barbarian, who wanted to use them as breeding stock to create Atlantean mutants and become stronger than his enemy Namor. Atuma had done his homework and ensured that Jean would not be able to use her strength against him to escape, but the precautions were taken keeping Marvel Girl's powers in mind. Jean used a Phoenix Force to escape along with her sister, but Sarah had unfortunately become a water breather who could not adjust to life on land. She begged Jean to help her so she could reunite with her husband and kids, so Jean rebuilt Sarah's biology at a cellular level to get rid of the genetic virus, turning her into a surface dweller. This nearly drained all of her power, however, and she would have drowned had it not been for Sarah, who pulled her to shore. Ultimately, Jean edited her sister's memories to remove any traces of the ordeal, as well as the true extent of her own powers. Things started to get messy from X-Men 136, when an unstable Jean, who had turned into the Dark Phoenix, arrived at her parents' house for a while. Sarah was staying there at the time and was again worried about her children inheriting Jean's abilities. Her telepathy allowed her to peer inside the minds of her family members, and while she acknowledges their love for her, she also noticed their apprehension and realizes that deep down, they are scared of her. Things went sideways, and John asks, "Who are you? What are you? In heaven's name, what do you want from us?" Jean meekly blurted out that she was their daughter, to which the man says that she cannot possibly be his and cast her out. Ultimately, Dark Phoenix raged out of control, and Jean killed herself to prevent any more destruction. The funeral was attended by her parents as well as Sarah and Paul, and the fog she had placed on Sarah's memories became clear after her death. She now remembered how Jean had saved her from the Atlanteans earlier, and let go of her mixed feelings about her own kids inheriting Jean's abilities. In New Mutants 46, Sarah went on television to advocate for mutant rights. She says it's criminal that they should be harassed in this fashion. She did not know that Jean was alive again and was watching her interview from Jamaica Bay. This finally prompted the younger sister to return to her family and inform them of her resurrection. But Sarah's home was blown up by anti-mutant bombers, and Jean never found any clues about what happened to her. Later, when Wolverine and Storm visited Sarah's house, even they found no clue. There was one account that believed the older Grey daughter was ambushed and handed over to Cameron Hodge of the Right as a disposable test subject, thanks to her views. In X-Men Second Series number 36, Stephen Lang finally confirmed the speculation about Sarah's fate. Her husband Paul's whereabouts were never clarified either, and most fans believe that he was killed. So what happened to her twins? Unfortunately, they ended up with Nanny, who belonged to the mutant-hating Right and had intense childcare fixation. I know how it sounds, and yes, it was an insane fetish. Sometimes, Nanny's enforcer, Orphan Maker, would even kill the parents of mutant children so they could be handed over to her to be raised as special boys and girls. Nanny used subliminal telepathy and chemical pixie dust to manipulate the memories of her victims, and the twins were no exception. In X Factor number 40, Jean finally rescues them and identifies herself as their aunt, but when she asks them where their mother is, they say, "We don't know you." Nanny says we must not talk to strangers. They are finally reunited with John and Elaine, whom they surprisingly remember. Jean leaves them there saying, home is where they belong, while she internally keeps hoping that her sister Sarah is alive and will be found one day. You might have also heard that Sarah had latent mutant potential, and this idea was reportedly floated by many writers too, but ultimately, she remained as human as they get. In fact, even her kids showed some abilities under Nanny's influence, but without it, they did not possess any psionic powers. If you read Phoenix number 10 to 15, you'll find a more agreeable end to Sarah's storyline. I do not want to spoil that for you here. It just offers me some comfort. At least in one version of the comics, Sarah Grey found a happy ending. Grey's End, the night the Shi'ar tried to erase the entire bloodline, including the aunts, uncles, and in-laws nobody expected to matter. Before we get to the massacre itself, it is important to go through a quick roll call of all the members present, because the Grey family tree exploded with new names right before all of them were wiped out. Earlier, I mentioned Brian and Julia, two of Jean's siblings, who were apparently created just for the sake of making the massacre more brutal. There's a lot of debate about Brian and a few other characters, because their connection to Jean is inconsistent across various sources. I mean, this happened because they were all created just so they could die, and none of them had any relevant backstories, but we are discussing their family tree after all, so it makes sense to clarify the details. Initially, Brian Grey is revealed to be John's brother and Jean's favourite uncle, who was skilled at carpentry and worked as a football coach. Later in X-Men Phoenix Force Handbook and Uncanny X-Men First Series 544, Roger, Julie and Liam are confirmed as Jean's siblings, but Brian's position remains unclear. Considering that Rachel says Julie and Brian adopted Sarah's twins, it makes it a little odd that a niece and her uncle would do that. So maybe Brian was intended to be a spouse, or was he another Grey sibling, which would then mean John and Elaine had 6 kids, including Jean and Sarah. My conspiracy theory map meme comparison makes sense now, right? We are not done. Rachel mentions Becca Wallace, a cousin of hers, making her John and Elaine's granddaughter. She was a teacher like John and was engaged. Becca had even brought her fiancé over to the party and was planning to have kids. This unnamed fiancé too became collateral damage in the massacre that happened that night. There were a few other people at the house, and I'm not sure exactly how they were related to Jean and Rachel. These included Julian, who liked Harry Potter and South Park. He's listed as Jean's nephew in X-Men Phoenix Force Handbook, which also lists Mary Margaret and Kendra as her nieces. Derek Campbell was also mentioned, and she was either a relative from Elaine's side of the family or another niece of Jean. Finally, there was Fred Harriman, who was not related to the Greys by blood and was simply an in-law to John. Sarah's children, Joey and Galen, were also at this party. The reason I brought up all these people is not just for contextual accuracy, but also to stress that the ones who wanted Jean's family dead left no stone unturned. They killed everyone present, even the people who did not share DNA with Jean and would have never manifested the Grey genome. Even young kids were not spared, because any of them could awaken the Phoenix Force in the future, since they were related to Jean by blood. Now for the big one. Remember how I said Rachel was happily adjusting to life with her grandparents? I was interrupted by a grandfather when she found a cute guy interested in her. They just started to bond even more deeply, and it is such a pity that moment did not last long. Rachel tried to comfort her grandfather by saying that they raised Jean well enough because she did save the universe. Then she revealed that she did not know how to dance. John took her hand and said, "Then Rachel, it will be my very great pleasure to teach you." Those unfortunately turned out to be his last words, as he was disintegrated by the Shi'ar attacks immediately after. The following issue, titled 24 Seconds, is pretty self-explanatory because it shows how the entire family is obliterated within that time frame to prevent the Phoenix Force from ever finding a host again. The entire group of aunts, uncles, cousins and in-laws are killed instantly, and the X-Men arrive too late to stop any of it. Elaine watches all her loved ones die before her eyes, and in the last moments wishes that she had never given birth to Jean. The only person left standing when the dust settles is Rachel, who the Shi'ar branded with the Phoenix symbol on her back so they can track her in case she ever manifests the Force herself. So who was the one that ordered this hit on the Grey family? Comic deliberately never addressed this, so it was anyone's guess. When Phoenix 4 was released, it was revealed that the Gladiator was the real mastermind. Here, he is specifically termed as the one who terminated the entire human bloodline of the Phoenix, an accusation he does not deny. Marrying into the Summers family. Until now, we have focused on Jean's family exclusively. The marriage to Scott Summers, aka Cyclops, seen in X-Men 30, causes the Grey family tree to merge into one giant Grey Summers mess. Jean's actual descendants end up carrying the Summers name rather than Grey,
which becomes a big part of Mr. Sinister's fixation on Scott and Jean as a couple in the first place. He was convinced their combined genetics could produce the most powerful mutant ever, one who could defeat Apocalypse. Christopher Summers was a pilot and the father of Scott and Alex, who was abducted along with his wife Catherine by the Shi'ar Empire when the kids were very young. When Catherine was killed by Diken, he escaped and joined the Starjammers, a group of space outlaws, and became known as Corsair. Alex, who later became Havoc, made his debut in Uncanny X-Men 54. They had another brother named Gabriel, who was born in Shi'ar space and later escaped to Earth. As Vulcan, he was an Omega-level mutant raised by Moira McTaggart and Professor X, and he seemingly died trying to save the X-Men. This caused Charles Xavier to erase Scott's memory of Gabriel, but Vulcan returned later to exact revenge and conquered the Shi'ar Empire. Once Scott married Jean, every single one of these people technically became her in-laws. Madeline Pryor, the clone who was never allowed to be her own person. Madeline Pryor might be one of the most tragic characters hanging off this entire family tree. After Jean apparently died during the Dark Phoenix saga, Mr. Sinister grew a fully adult clone of hers in secret, engineering her specifically to fall in love with Scott, so the two could eventually produce a child who would be capable of defeating Apocalypse. Unfortunately, this clone did not manifest any powers, as seen in Uncanny X-Men 241, so Mr. Sinister thought the experiment had failed. But when Jean was believed to have died, a spark of the Phoenix Force was bestowed on Madeline, as she was an exact genetic clone of Jean. This way, it granted her life and access to some of Jean's memories, though most of them were vague. She met Scott in Alaska, and due to resemblance to Jean, he was attracted to her. He was even made to think she was the Dark Phoenix, thanks to Mastermind's manipulation. In Uncanny X-Men number 175, Scott and Madeline got married after a brief courtship, and after their honeymoon, Scott chose to retire and care for his family. So far so good, right? Sounds like the perfect fairy tale romance after all. Unfortunately, Madeline was only a clone, not the real Jean. Scott eventually returned to the X-Men, leaving his now pregnant wife alone at their mansion. The pair started drifting away slowly. While other members of the team would check upon Madeline from time to time, Scott seemed to just move farther away from her. She gave birth to their son Nathan alone in the kitchen of the mansion she lived in. Naturally, she was embittered and humiliated, because it was increasingly clear that Scott was very much in love with the original Jean and married Maddie simply because of the resemblance she shared with the former. She used her powers to influence the outcome of a fight between Scott and Storm, as they were trying to determine who was worthy enough to lead the X-Men. Scott lost, and Madeline convinced him to move with her to a remote cabin in Alaska and raise their child together. Side note, this extremely remote location was actually Sinister's doing, since it would allow him to study the child and abduct him if needed. Anyway, the pair did move in together, but when Jean came back, Scott wasted no time abandoning his wife and son to be with the love of his life. Pretty jackass move on his part, if you ask me, because not only did Madeline not know why he suddenly abandoned them, Scott himself was unable to tell Jean that he had married someone while she was presumed dead. Now even Mrs. Sinister tried to remove Madeline from the picture because Jean was back and he had no use for a clone. So he sent his marauders to kill her and abduct her baby boy, and while she was able to defend herself, she lost her son to them. She then woke up after a few months in a San Francisco hospital, and as seen in X Factor number 13 at that time, there was no record of either her or her child in existence, thanks to Sinister removing every trace of them. She then began an affair with Alex, her brother-in-law, and finally got to know the truth about her existence from Mr. Sinister himself. She was never her own person. She was simply a backup plan that was abandoned the moment the real Jean showed up, and Madeline descended into madness when she found that Scott had left her to be with Jean. I'm sure most of you know what happens to her next. She allies herself with the demons, Syme and Nasir, and becomes the Goblin Queen. She even comes disturbingly close to sacrificing her own son before the Phoenix Force inside her abandons her to return to Jean. I know Madeline is a villain, and she's done some pretty nasty stuff, but what other option did she have really? She became a villain not out of pure malice, but because everyone in her life, including the man who created her and the husband who left her, treated her as disposable the moment she stopped being useful to them. Cable, the son Jean never carried, but ended up raising anyway. If you are wondering what happened to the child the Marauders kidnapped when they attacked Madeline, he grew up to become the mutant Cable. His destiny was planned even before he or his biological mother came into existence. When Nathan was a baby, his alternate reality half-sister Rachel created a psi bond with him, promising to look after him. After being kidnapped, Mrs. Sinister ran all kinds of experiments on him, and he was discovered only when Scott and Jean were sent to the lab, thanks to Destiny's advice. Jean and Nathan were able to form a telepathic link, so when Madeline tried to sacrifice him and 9 other mutant children, Jean tried her best to stop her. Ultimately, when the portion of the Phoenix Force in Jean's clone returned to her, she received all of Madeline's memories, including those in which she raised Nathan. In this way, she became his mother in every way that mattered. The boy was kidnapped a second time. Seriously, he could not catch a break. and Apocalypse infected him with a techno-organic virus which could kill him. Following this, in X Factor 6568, Sister Ascani from 2,000 years in the future travelled back in time and revealed to Scott that his son would become a savior. Since she could not make another time jump, Nathan was trapped in the future timeline, and Scott resigned himself to believing that he would never see his child again. Strife, the clone raised to think he was the real one. Did you think we were done with clones? Hell no. Clearly lessons were not learned, with the disastrous consequences from the whole Madeline and Jean situation. When Nathan was brought to the future, the Ascani clan initially believed that technology could heal the effects of the virus. However, there was no firm guarantee that the cure would work, so Mother Ascani cloned Nathan to create another version of him, just in case the original boy did not survive. To find the odds, however, Nathan grew up to be a healthy boy, so the clan once again had a clone they did not exactly need. Apocalypse did them an involuntary favour in that way when he invaded them and took the clone away, thinking he was the real Nathan and raised him. Meanwhile, Jean and Scott, who had managed to travel through time, came to the Ascani clan and raised Nathan. Apocalypse simply wanted to use the clone as a vessel the next time he needed a host body and named him Strife. He then followed a particularly bad pattern of parenting, encouraging arrogance and hostility in the boy. No one knew that he was not actually the real Nathan Summers, so when Cable finally killed Apocalypse, Strife had to go into hiding before consolidating his strength and becoming the leader of the new Canaanites. The two of them eventually went on to become bitter enemies without knowing the relationship they shared. Tyler Dayspring, the grandson who became the villain Genesis, tragically continued to play the Grey family tree, or rather the Grey Summers family tree. In an alternate universe where Apocalypse ruled supreme, Tyler was earlier Jen Scott's child and the adopted son of Nathan Summers, who raised him as part of Clan Chosen. He was raised to fight alongside them, but after his mother was killed, Tyler himself was captured by Strife. There he was tortured and brainwashed into rejecting Cable's beliefs. He pretty much became Strife's pawn, you know? So when Clan Chosen prepared for another attack, Tyler created a neural link between himself and Dawn Silk, a clan member. It was not an easy decision for Nathan, obviously, but to save Dawn Silk, he was forced to shoot his son. This inflicted some damage on Tyler's mind, and even though it was later repaired, he never forgave Nathan for his actions. Eventually, he had travelled to the present under the name Tolliver in X-Force number 5, before fully adopting the identity of Genesis, convincing himself that he deserved to wield the power Apocalypse enjoyed. He then captured Wolverine and tried to turn him into one of his horsemen. Looking back, this was a horrible miscalculation because it sent Wolverine into a frenzied state that ended with Tyler's death. Hope Summers, the adopted daughter raised to save mutant kind. After the Scarlet Witch went berserk and stripped most mutants of their abilities during the events of House of M, Hope was the first mutant to be born on Earth in X-Men 205. To Captain Louise Spaulding. Right off the bat, what set her apart from every other mutant was the fact that a gene was detectable at birth. This was so powerful that the mutant detection computer the X-Men used went completely offline, unable to handle her awakening. Naturally, other mutants were able to sense her presence, and an unofficial competition of sorts began among different groups to acquire her. Mr. Sinister was among them, but before any of these bad guys could lay a hand on her, Cable secretly whisked her to safety, believing that she would become a messiah figure who would save mutant kind. He took her to the mutant forge so that he could obtain the parts needed to travel to the future. Bishop, one of the X-Men, was waiting there, and he had this horrible premonition that Hope would end up killing 1 million humans in Earth 1191, so he attacked an unsuspecting Cable. He also pursued them through time later for the same reason. Sinister was still very much part of the race to acquire Hope, so his marauders attacked everyone at that point and brought the baby to him. From there, Mystique stole her to cure her foster child, Rogue's comatose state, and was successful. Finally, Professor X got his hands on Hope and left her into the care of Cable, where she originally was. Okay, but why is she connected to the Grey Summers family tree? Well, she's not related to either Jean or Scott by blood, but since Nathan was her adoptive father, I have included her in this list. Her connection to the sprawling Grey and Summers bloodline is built entirely on family in the emotional sense rather than genetics. I find that kind of refreshing. So far, we have seen clones being made left and right, so Hope's inclusion proves that not every branch here needed a lab setting or a Phoenix Force miracle to exist. Rachel Summers, the daughter from a future that technically never happened. We have taken a look at Rachel already while discussing the Grey family massacre, but who is she really? And what does it mean that her timeline never actually happened? Well, she is the biological daughter of Jean and Scott from Earth 811, the Days of Future Past timeline. In the comics, when legislation was passed to crack down on mutant activity, Xavier's school for gifted youngsters is attacked, and Jean Grey is killed in a nuclear explosion caused by Mastermind. Rachel survived but was captured, brainwashed, and tortured for months by the leader of the anti-mutant forces. She's then forced to use her telepathic abilities to hunt other mutants. She finally broke free from her brainwashing and reunites with Franklin Richards, the son of Reed Richards and Sue Storm. In Uncanny X-Men 141, she used her powers to send Kitty Pryde's mind back in time to change the course of history. Part of her also traveled to the future to look after her half-brother Cable under the name Mother Ascani. Nate Gray, the son, built in a lab in a ruined timeline. Once again, we have a character who exists because Mr. Sinister could not mind his own business. In the Age of Apocalypse timeline, where Professor X had died before he was able to form the X-Men, Sinister gathered biological samples of Scott Summers and Jean Grey and created Nate Gray, also known as X-Man. There are many parallels between him and Cable, beyond the fact that they are both Jean and Scott's sons, because both were created to fulfill the same goal, the destruction of Apocalypse. After using a shard of the Umkran crystal to escape his home reality, Nate crossed over into the main Marvel timeline, Earth 616. The dissipated essence of Madeline Pryor, technically his stepmother, was channeled into a physical body, and she became good friends with Nate until she left to join the newly reformed Hellfire Club. His encounter with Professor X inadvertently allowed Onslaught to escape from the latter's mind. Nate was even captured by Onslaught to exploit his extraordinary psionic powers, but Earth's heroes ended up defeating him. Later, Nate became a mutant shaman and heroically sacrificed himself to stop the alien harvester. We went from an 18th century Hellfire Club aristocrat to a cloned wife, cloned sons, and a daughter who came from a reality that no longer exists. Along the way, this family tragically lost nearly all their members to a massacre lasting 24 seconds, but somehow kept producing some of the most powerful mutants in Marvel. Every name is connected to something bigger than you can imagine, spanning numerous timelines and identities. If you're stuck around until the end, thank you from the bottom of my heart. Make sure to hit the subscribe button because there's plenty more where this came from. Until then.